unpack the real issues affecting the Tasman nations, this is Trans-Tasman Talk. Jointly produced by the Unshackled.net and rightminds.nz. Now here's Tim Willems in Australia and Dewey DeBoer in New Zealand.
Hello and welcome to another week of Trans-Tasman Talk. It's 7 p.m. here in Melbourne.
And it's 9 p.m. here in Auckland.
We're back at the regular time this week because, well, at least here in Melbourne, we put our clocks forward an hour on Saturday night, so our times align again.
Yes, it's good to be in daylight savings, and I hope you have adjusted as well.
Yeah, we survived the Saturday night losing now, so now I can just enjoy the sunshine after dark, though it's been raining both yesterday and today, and the Extinction Rebellion protesters in Melbourne were singing in the rain, which we were told it was never going to rain again.
Very good. We had rain the first week of daylight savings as well, but now that we're in our second week, the sun has been shining, and I've actually spent the last 2 evenings outside gardening. So very, very right-wing activity these days, and I'm enjoying the extra sunlight in the evenings.
Clock climate change.
You'd think. Good evening to everyone in the chat as well. I'm seeing a few people in there.
Yes, we are on the Unshackled YouTube channel. We're also on the Right Minds YouTube channel. We both monitor our respective chats. And of course, the best thing about the Unshackled live chat is that you can send us through a super chat if you want us to read out your comment on air and also support, or at least the Unshackled. At least I sent you earlier today the entropy software. Obviously, you didn't get enough time to view it.
Oh, no. Yeah. Now, we will definitely look into that and see if we can get some super chat set up here as well. Until then, I will only be answering questions from people that I like, or, you know, if I like your comment, maybe I'll read it out.
Yes, you have complete discretion.
Very good. So we had Extinction Rebellion protests in Auckland, in Wellington this week, not in Auckland, just the capital. That was yesterday. They disrupted traffic. They ended up getting arrested eventually, 30 of them. They were released without charge after blocking a busway. So they were allowed to block some government buildings, a bank, and then eventually when they tried to disrupt the bus traffic, they were carted away by the police.
It's such an endearing strategy to just inconvenience people. They claim that petitions and traditional protests haven't worked. So they mean that civility and a rule of law hasn't worked. So that apparently justifies it.
I know, and this isn't the first time something like this has been tried either. It's not going to end very well for them already. They have no support from Jacinda here in New Zealand, which might be a surprise to some of the Australian viewers. But Jacinda actually condemned them and said that blocking people from going about their normal business is not a good way to protest, and it's not a good way to be heard.
Oh, I think that might cut deep.
To some of them it will. And in a weird sense of irony, the leader of the opposition, Simon Bridges, came to their defense and said that the woke government hadn't been doing enough on climate, and that the protesters should march on Wellington instead, on Parliament buildings instead, and protest the government. And Simon Bridges, in fact, even claimed that he would do much better than the current government on issues of climate.
He could just be trying to wedge Jacinda, play some 4D chess, because he's in opposition. He can't do anything, so you can just say stuff like that.
He's definitely having some fun with it, but I'm not sure if it's going to win him any endearment with his fans, or if the Extinction Rebellion protests are essentially anti-capitalist protests. That's not going to win him any favors there.
I noticed, because I follow the New Zealand Young Nats Facebook page, and they're always trying to be hip and woke with what they're posting. We're the real progressives.
That basically sums up the National Party at the moment. they basically tried to out virtue signal the left and say that they are far more progressive.
Well, obviously, our national party in Australia is different. The rural-based minor coalition partner, but in the state of New South Wales, the national party there, they're pretty woke. In fact, you can't really tell them from the Greens. I mean, New South Wales's rural towns have now run out of water, and they've been busy in the parliament, or the state national MPs legalising abortion and virtue signalling on a whole bunch of other progressive causes.
Yeah, it's a real pity there. This is probably a good moment for me to let our New Zealand audience know that the local elections end this week. So today was actually your last day to send in your postal ballot, and we will know the results on Saturday. And I have seen a lot more noise recently from basically sort of third-party candidates. They're all independent, really, but the media generally picks two candidates in each region that they pit against each other without any actual polling. And there's been a lot more uproar recently of these other candidates being left out and saying, hey, there's no polling to support the two front runners, right? They're called the front runners, but they've purely been selected by the media. And you know that, and others have been excluded from the debates, and there have been some campaigns run online to basically brigade the chat rooms of the debates and mention the other candidates.
It sounds similar to what they're doing in the United States in the moment with the Democrat primaries with Tulsi Gabbard. She's now in the fourth debate, but she was excluded based on these media rules. And rebel media in Canada, they've been trying to cover the federal election going up there, and one of their reporters, David Menzies, he actually got arrested for going up to the Conservative leader Andrew Schiff just in public, just to ask him if he supported free speech. I think he got the answer, and so the rebel media, they successfully launched a lawsuit to get media access to the debate, and they got it. So that's good. Nice. But yeah, the forces always work against the minor or alternative players, I should say.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. The people in power, the elites and the globalists, they got to try and run a tight ship. But it's our jobs to get in there and make life a little bit difficult for them.
Yes, Rebel Media is doing a great job up there, just being a pain up there. David Menzies, he's actually this really sort of old guy, but he's an excellent just doing this street stuff. He's probably the most valuable player, I'd say, of the team, and probably most underrated street provocateur, I think, in the world. He's just really good.
It's really encouraging to see, and yeah, we need some more of that here in New Zealand. I think I mentioned this last week, but this week as well, I've really been enjoying Avi Yemeni's videos again, just getting down there with the communist protesters, and it's good fun. In some way, the pro Communist Party of China protesters are kind of very similar to these environmentalist protesters.
He's getting around to everything at the moment. The climate protests, the Hong Kong democracy ones, the vegan ones. He's been at court this week because he's fighting charges that are stemming from when he was an election candidate during the Victorian state election. Because when he was because we have the how to vote card people outside the polling booths. You don't have that in New Zealand. That's a fun fact.
That's banned. That's illegal. Yeah. It's
yes.
Banned. In fact, showing any kind of advertising is banned, even online. So if you post, they actually shut down the social media pages of parties. They actually get unpublished. Like they will go to the extent of unpublishing their Facebook page.
Yeah, I remember it was a big shock to me when I got there and basically I had to basically copy what you would do, take down everything to do with the New Zealand election, just in that period, and you get your free speech back at 7 p.m. when the polls close.
That's right.
Yes. When Avi ran as a state election candidate for the Australian Liberty Alliance, there was a lot of confrontations he had with other candidates or volunteers outside the polling booth that he was in, and he filmed a lot of those. And so there's laws against intimidation at polling booths, and so that's the aftermath of that.
Yeah, being a street provocateur is really good, but then being a street provocateur on election day when you're running for, the was it Senate or was it the local?
State upper house.
Okay, state upper house. Yeah. So that's not really a good idea to do that, no.
Yeah, there's if you and I both know, well, electoral law anywhere in the world is very strict.
Very much so.
Well, it's obviously the laws are not being that strict with these Extinction Rebellion protesters. So this is on Monday. I haven't got today's figures of the arrests. So there were 38 arrests in Sydney. There were 10 in Melbourne, and there were 7 in Brisbane. Today in Brisbane, because this is where the Extinction Rebellion protests have been centred, is because that's where the Adani coal mine is going to be built in central Queensland, which Brisbane is the capital. The Queensland state Labor government, they're only just getting around this week to making these disruptive protests a criminal offence. It's like, well, they've only been warning you they're going to do this for the past 2 months. I mean, like, it doesn't take a genius to look at the Extinction Rebellion calendar and realise that it's Rebellion Week.
Yeah, they're a bit slow. In New Zealand as well, we had a nice photo of the police on their way to attend the protest on their bicycles. And I'm not sure how you arrest someone and carry them back to the police station on your bicycle, but they eventually did arrest 30 in Wellington, which I already mentioned. That's the only one in New Zealand. At least that was reported. Somebody in the chat can let me know if there were any more. But just 30 arrests and zero charges laid. They managed to cause a whole lot of havoc with traffic, and that was basically the point at which they were arrested. They were allowed to disrupt businesses, but as soon as they were disrupting commuters, that's when they were dragged away.
Yeah, in Brisbane, all they're getting is just a fine, no convictions, and then they're free to go out and protest again. In Melbourne last week, when the vegans had their International Day of Rebellion, or whatever it was called back then, they were trying to get everyone to watch their vegan propaganda movie Dominion. And they blocked the traffic in Melbourne in between Swanston and Flinders Street during peak hour, which is major intersection. And so they charged 36 vegan activists. They got a $100 fine from the court, which they could donate to a charity of their choice, and no conviction. That's
bizarre. I mean, the judges are a real problem with the justice system in New Zealand as well. We have, sometimes we get the opposition say, if when we're in charge, we'll increase penalties on this and that and the other thing. But the judges never give those penalties, right? And so you're likely going to be running into the same issue there in Australia, where even if Scott Morison passed some new kind of law, or if at the state level some new laws were passed, there's no chance of them being enforced by the judiciary.
I mean, if they're giving out community orders to people who've been convicted of serious violent and sexual offences, then obviously they're not going to give much to people who block traffic during one day, even though it's inconveniencing thousands to thousands of people. And it's been warned by many watchers of this that what if an ambulance gets held up one of these days and somebody dies because these people were super gluing themselves to the road or suspending themselves from a bridge. This is what happened today in Brisbane. Last week, a professional climate protester, she suspended herself from the top of the bridge in a pod, and what was most disturbing about her is that she'd given her job up as a midwife because she didn't want to bring children into this climate apocalyptic world to become a full-time activist. So it actually disturbed her bringing life into this world, which was so there's been a man in Brisbane today underneath the Brisbane Story Bridge, climate protester Paul Jukes. He's swinging from a makeshift harness 10 meters below the bridge and 50 meters above the river. And he vowed to stay as long as it takes to have climate action, packed several days' worth of supplies, but things changed when police were planning to remove him, and he only lasted about 6 hours. I love this quote here. Instead of replying to my request, the Premier would prefer to send the police to come out and get me. Well, if you want to speak to the Premier, just make an appointment or go up to her, and she does press conferences in public all the time. Imagine if everybody who wanted to speak to the Premier did something like that.
Yeah, but they don't really want to speak to the Premier because they know that it's not that they want to speak to the Premier, they want the answer to their question to be yes, right? It's not asking the question, they want to dictate the answer. And that's why they try and pull these stunts in the hope that eventually they will force them into, that the government will be forced to give them what they want. It's at the very moment a very mild form of terrorism in that sense.
What would you call it? Transportation terrorism.
Yeah, basically, yeah.
Holding the whole city to gridlock unless your demands are met. Basically,
yeah. Yeah. And it has been done in the past where people have run if you plan a march or a protest, you end up disrupting traffic. That's one thing. But yeah, to not get a permit for that essentially, and to just pick peak hour to wreak as much havoc as you can, that is not acceptable and should not be tolerated. And at least in New Zealand, almost it sounds like we're getting swifter action against that, surprisingly, than you have been in New South Wales.
Oh, well, New South Wales, that has a Liberal government, so that's why most of the arrests were there, while Victoria and Queensland, they have a left-wing Labor governments who've basically been turning a blind eye, not taking seriously, even been enabling for many years these type, my city of Melbourne is pretty much the home of Antifa. They've terrorised private events, blocking people from getting in. They've been running amok for ages. They're planning to disrupt the annual pro-life event here in Melbourne, the 10th annual March for the Babies, which is on the 10th anniversary of the passing of the Victorian Abortion Law Reform Act. There's a lot of families who come to this because babies add to families, and so they're planning.
Yeah, that's right.
And even it was reported in our Herald Sun today that the Extinction Rebellion protesters, they're planning a nudie run in Melbourne on Saturday, which would seem to imply that it could possibly go into the path of the March for the Babies, basically public indecency in front of families and young children.
Mm-hmm. Yes, in addition to their hatred for capitalism, they seem to also hate families and children, as you've mentioned before. We have the birth striking and women quitting their jobs as midwives, and they have a complete they essentially have a hatred for humanity as a whole. They are so caught up in their worship of the planet Earth that they basically see everyone as parasites.
Well, one of the leaders of the Brisbane Extinction Rebellion, he's a young 20-year-old who lives at his parents' mansion. So obviously he believes in some family values.
Yeah, family money maybe.
Well, aren't they? But he's wanting to. His parents shouldn't be entitled to that money if he's aiming to just. I'll just play for
wants to give it all away, I'm sure.
Yeah, I'll just play for our audience just the opening bit of this is from 7 News in Sydney, just the opening of their report from last night.
For some protests...
I've got to get it back to back to the beginning. Here we go.
For some protesters, their revolution was short-lived. Others showed little regard for authority, confronting arresting officers. They're proud.
The only thing I can do is give up my liberty, and it's worth it.
Passionate and eager to cause a scene.
We need to save the planet!
They're called Extinction Rebellion, the group blocking...
Yeah, that's enough. But yeah, having the red communist flag there, saying you want a revolution.
Mm-hmm. And that's what it's all about. It's just the rebranding of red as green instead. And it's the old name of the greens, the watermelons.
Yes.
Red on the inside, green on the outside. And it was more like a joke, but now it's real.
Well, socialist
Or it was hidden.
alternative, our main revolutionary Marxist group, Trotskyist group. I'm not sure if they're a worldwide group. Is there socialist alternative in New Zealand?
We have had socialist. So there was a group called Socialist Aotearoa, which may have been sort of the equivalent of that. But they keep changing their name, so I'm not actually sure if they're associated.
Now, Aratoa, our Australian audience, they'll probably be chastised for not knowing maybe what that word means.
Yes, Aotearoa is the Maori name for New Zealand. That's the way it's marketed. Actually, the name was not really used much by the Maori, except for one tribe used it to refer to the North Island. It was really popularized by the sort of early 20th century European romantics who made this is most people don't know this, but it's true. It was used in the anthem and in the translation of the anthem by a poet, and there was I was going to say an anthem, was a symphony called Aotearoa that was written in the early 1900s, and it's been basically picked up as the alternative name for New Zealand. So.
It's a Maori term that was culturally appropriated. So that means if somebody like you called it Opera and so did me, we're cultural appropriation. We should call it New Zealand, because that's our cultural name for it.
Yes, it is. But yeah, there is a push, and by this you'll see it in the Extinction Rebellion protests and so on. They will always refer to New Zealand as Aotearoa, and the Green Party always will as well. And so it's kind of like, some people have compared it to the renaming of Myanmar. Basically, they want to overthrow the current system and replace it with Aotearoa.
I'm not sure if they have they're left here, they just want to abolish Australia. But the thing is, the Aboriginal population, they're all different tribes. And so wherever you go, it's a different Aboriginal land. And so you don't say that you're in the Aboriginal nation, which is called Australia. You're in this land.
Yeah.
That's what a lot of these woke social justice warriors post in their Twitter bio. I'm from this land.
Yeah. So, because we have the same thing in New Zealand, we're not all. There was no such thing as united tribes. The Northland tribes did unite after the Europeans came, but there has been more of that in recent times, where there is kind of the attempt to forge a unified Maori identity. And same thing, the language, they used to have different dialects, but the missionaries did a very good job of standardizing the language, and I believe that's something you don't have in Australia as much either. There's not one Aboriginal language, is there?
No, there's hundreds.
Yeah, so in New Zealand we've managed to unify the language and like most of the cultural practices and so on. There is still quite a bit of inter-tribal rivalry. I'm sure that someone in the chat will point that out. But usually it gets to the point of they're united against a common enemy if it comes to it, the tribes. But very few Maori are really into the whole tribal system as well. So there's not too much that I'd be worried about, really. But it is definitely part of the globalist agenda in terms of trying to overthrow the they want to overthrow the capitalist system and replace it with the old-fashioned tribal communist tribalism.
Yes, they're becoming more and more obvious.
And I was going to point this out at the beginning, but now is the perfect time to do it. Today is actually a special day, and it should be a celebratory day, perhaps even a public holiday, but sadly there's too many left-wingers around. But it is 250 years today since Captain Cook discovered or rediscovered New Zealand, and he landed and on New Zealand today, and this basically marks the birth of modern New Zealand, when contact with Europe was opened up and colonization followed quite a bit later on, but it was not too far from now, 250 years ago, where trade started happening, and Captain Cook initiated some of that trade. There are some angry people, though, because there was a early confrontation where several Maori were killed, because Captain Cook he had the reports from Abel Tasman, obviously, who had come many years before.
Who's our show's named after, and the sea's named after.
Yes, exactly. So the namesake there. And so Abel Tasman had a really bad time. Some of his crew were murdered and eaten. So Captain Cook was a lot safer. And he ended up shooting first, asking questions later. But there was that misunderstanding, and the High Commissioner actually offered to apologize to the tribe last week, which caused a big uproar in New Zealand. The former National Party leader, Don Brash, actually called for his resignation, saying that they were interfering in New Zealand's essentially the worsening race relations in New Zealand, by suggesting that the English government needed to apologize for this tragic event that, in fact, Captain Cook himself was not happy with. It was an unfortunate event, and there were many different skirmishes that continued on down the line, and there's no need to go and relitigate all of that today.
Let's just talk about, you mentioned Don Brash for a moment, because he's the best Prime Minister you never had, and he almost won the 2005 New Zealand general election. So can you give a brief bio?
You stole my line there, because that was going to be my one-line summary of Don Brash, the best Prime Minister we never had. He was the governor of the Reserve Bank for many years in the 90s. I hope someone in the chat is going to tell me off. He went from economics into politics. He ran an excellent campaign against the Helen Clark government, and she basically managed to bribe him out of the election by offering lots of free stuff. And after that, he went and took over the ACT Party at one point, which didn't end up so well. But he's since had a resurgence in popularity in the last few years, because he's founded a group called Hobson's Pledge, and Hobson was our first governor, and he signed the Treaty of Waitangi, and he announced after that, we are now one people. And I'm not going to attempt to do that in Maori, because I'll butcher it and somebody will get mad at me. But he did say it in their language, and that's kind of the ethos of Hobson's Pledge, is that we are one people in New Zealand.
He's probably, I would say, the original anti-identity politics politician. Even back in 2005, he wanted to abolish Maori seats because all New Zealanders are equal, and a politician like him is needed today more than ever. Absolutely,
and he is. He's doing very well in an activist role. I think he never had much luck in politics, but he is having a lot more of an impact now. I believe he gets a lot of people turn up to hear him speak, and he wields quite a bit of influence. The media has to report on everything that he says, and he's got a lot of haters, and that really helps too. There are a lot of people who really hate the guy, and there's no real reason to hate Don Brash. I mean, you can have, he has imperfections, of course, but he's not a hateful person or a racist or anything like that, which is what they want to accuse him of.
No, definitely not. I've admired him for a number of years, and yeah, I assume the media, they want to gotcha him as much as possible, but they don't have much luck.
Yeah. I actually got it right. So he was the Reserve Bank governor from 1988 to 2002. So he spent, that's 14 years as the Reserve Bank governor. Very, very long time.
Who appointed him?
1988. That would have been the national prime minister after David Lange, and I'm not sure what his name is.
I won't say anything, but people in the chat will allow them to correct you. Anyway. So
okay, well, you do that, thank you. And as a Reserve Bank governor, he was actually very politically active in the sense because the Reserve Bank was very independent from the government and still is considered to be today. He actually would go out of his way to basically neutralize policy he didn't like by taking, financial by adjusting the interest rates, basically. So if the government was going to announce some new project where they need a lot more money, he would just chuck the interest rates up or down and throw a spanner in the works.
So he was basically one of the most responsible Reserve Bank governors ever to exist in the world. I mean, we have 0 interest rates in the United States. Our interest rates now been dropped to 0.75, which we were told that 5% interest rates under John Howard were great, and now they're less than 1%. Has he been asked about that?
Too right now. I don't think he's commented on that recently. No. It's possible that he has, but it won't have got any publicity. The only thing that he really gets asked to comment on these days is race relations. I've been asked to mention as well that he has been deplatformed recently at Massey University. We may have mentioned that on a past show already, and that caused a big uproar as well, and he was actually later on invited back to speak. And so the attempts to deplatform him have actually failed in New Zealand, which is good because a lot of other people are getting deplatformed. But Don Brash is definitely still important enough to not get deplatformed. In relation to the treaty as well that I mentioned before, is not all of the tribes actually signed up to the treaty, and so there were some what's referred to now as the New Zealand land wars, and what in Britain at the time they referred to as the New Zealand Rebellion. Where there were some tribes that were basically conquered or subdued and brought under the rule of the crown. And obviously there's still a bit of tension going on there, as you can imagine.
Does that mean that you can claim, because you're not a British descendants of British immigrants, you're Dutch, does that mean that you can claim that you're not party to this treaty? Because if some Maori tribes are not claim that basically the Constitution of New Zealand doesn't apply to them, does that mean you can say it doesn't apply to you?
So I could try that, but it wouldn't work.
But you see the logic there.
I see the logic there, and but what happened as well is obviously the crown, the English crown, all that power was vested in the New Zealand government, and so the New Zealand government is now the crown. So if the New Zealand government lets you in, you're under the crown. And same with the ones that didn't sign it. They were forcibly subdued, and by the right of conquest, they are likewise under the Constitution. So but it's usually handled fairly diplomatically in New Zealand and in a fairly bipartisan fashion, really. In the political sense, there is always a strong voice against some of the settlements, and then on the other side you have people who want more of them, who aren't happy. But in general, there's actually it's considered to be a rather settled subject, really.
Wow, that's quite refreshing to hear that, given what we put up with here in Australia, where at first it was the proposal was to have Aboriginal people mentioned in our constitution. Now it's gone to having a Aboriginal voice to Parliament enshrined in the constitution. The pattern is that the more that you grant the supposed Aboriginal elders, the more and more they demand.
And we do have a little bit of that problem here as well, and so we have the what they call full and final settlements, but they're never always quite. I mean, they at the moment they're doing fairly well with full and final in not giving more. And recently we have had an issue where Jacinda has almost tried to get involved in a land dispute, and thankfully backed away from that. Because once you undermine one of these agreements, then it's like dominoes and it all falls over. So the system can be ripped apart, but currently it works fairly well. And there, like you said, it's there's talk of removing the Maori seats as if they're no longer needed. We actually have more Maori in Parliament as a percentage of the population than they're granted by the seats. So the idea of actually needing seats for them is not relevant, because far more of them are elected, on the general roll anyway. And so the discussion here really is about getting rid of some of that and also closing down the final settlement process. So yeah, there are always people who want to dig that back up, but I believe that overall things actually are looking up very much in that regard in New Zealand, and especially if you compare it to Australia and everything that did happen in Australia. Everything that to the Aboriginals, what happened to them was far worse than anything that happened here in New Zealand.
Now you mentioned university deplatforming, but there was quite an outrage at the University of Auckland this past week, where a alleged white supremacist club has been advertising for members. Well, it's for white male European only New Zealanders.
That's right, and they have to be able-bodied as well, and so like army recruits, but it is I'm not sure how you would describe this group. I suppose it is
what's it called? Because their name has been censored.
The name has been censored. It's called Action Zealandia, and the name has actually been shown in some of the media outlets as well, but they've essentially given them tens of thousands of dollars in free advertising.
Which is why they're now censoring it.
We're contributing to the problem here. But yeah, so if they had never talked about it, nobody would know, right? It's one of these issues where the fact they ran heaps and heaps of stories about it, that it's become a big issue. And the Vice Chancellor of Auckland University actually said that he wasn't going to ban this, their recruitment posters, because he said, well, there's nothing hateful about them, right? It's just like a logo and a website and says, we join our people, something like that. And he has had to back down a little bit. I suspect university students were ripping all of them off anyway. But this kind of group we have had before, and we have, I believe we talked about them on the Unshackled Waves, possibly a year or more ago, the Dominion movement in New Zealand, which were kind of like some kind of identitarian group, is maybe the closest that you can get to. But we seem to have sort of budget identitarians compared to what they have in Europe.
Well, apparently this weekend in Melbourne, there's going to be a neo-Nazi concert, which it's just going to be basically a private gathering in a residence, which is termed as a concert. But there's a 20,000 petition from Get Up demanding that it be made illegal. And so there's been this huge, because I'd never heard of this group. I can't even remember what their name is, but this is how outrage, how these social justice people getting triggered. They seek out these fringe groups and amplify their message. I mean, they're not very smart.
It's bizarre to see, and the Streisand effect in action. But why they keep doing it is just it beggars belief, really. Why would you keep promoting the groups of these people who you say need to be banned? Because every single time they make them more popular, and they, like I said, tens of thousands of dollars in free advertising.
Yeah, I can't believe that. Just how the normal, like when you were a child, you were told that if you wanted something to stop annoying you, you'd ignore it, like you wouldn't. Yeah, and it's actually what I've done with some of these left-wing groups. I've ignored them, and some of them I haven't heard from them in like months or a year or something. It is that case of if it's not serious, if you ignore the problem, it will go away. Oh, unfortunately, these Extinction Rebellion people, if you're putting canoes on the main road and suspending yourself from bridges, supergluing yourselves to the road crossings, then unfortunately, we can't turn away because people need
Yeah.
to get to work.
So they've realized the opposite. They've been so busy amplifying their opponents in these fringe groups that they don't like, and they've realized that nobody wants to amplify them. And so now they're having to find creative ways to amplify themselves.
And I love how with these Extinction Rebellion protests, the left now suddenly believe in free speech, or what they think is free speech. I mean, what they always claim that they support free speech but not hate speech, and hate speech is basically anything that we deem offensive or that we take offense of on other people's behalf. That's normally how it works. But they believe that going into private property or disrupting how public places, roads are designed to operate, that's free speech. Well, they've put out a justification for it that nothing else is. They call it civil disobedience. Like that's the. They're claiming that, oh well, we tried the normal way, that basically means nobody was interested in your message.
Exactly. And generally speaking, if you are engaging in civil disobedience, it's usually not that disruptive either. You know, they with the post, they actually had this with the posters. I saw a clip, and they interviewed one of these girls at Auckland Uni, who was holding a sign that was saying, this one was interviewed, said ripping down these posters was their right to free speech. So they said, well, it's okay for this group to have their free speech by sticking up posters. We're exercising our free speech by ripping their posters down. And it's like, no, destruction of private property is not free speech. Okay, if you're and that's the warped view that they have, right? It's like, you know, it's only free speech when they're doing something disruptive, but then when somebody else says something they don't like that's not at all disruptive, then suddenly it's hate speech.
There's never the same standards for both sides in their view, because they always believe they're morally superior. And so, and this is a lot of the time why right-wing groups tend to sort of get sucked in, is because they always sort of take the moral high ground with these people, and they end up losing.
Yes, and the best way to move past this is you know, these groups, ignore them as much as you can, and when you know, they are being disruptive, you know, the police need to just go in there and be swift, and the problem will solve itself.
Well, Peter Dutton, our Home Affairs Minister, he's proposed stripping welfare off these Extinction Rebellion protesters, the ones that go through the courts, because there was one who was revealed to be on government benefits and had it revoked. And this is another spin they put on it. The Greens Queensland Senator Larissa Waters saying, you're removing income support from people who engage in protest. Like, this is another one of their spin, that they're just expressing their view, and well, it's not their money. Like,
no,
it's the people who are driving on the road during peak hour. Where do you think they're going, these people, during peak hour?
They're going to work, exactly.
Yes, and pay taxes.
Yeah, and to protest is, if they were standing outside a building with a sign, right, that's what protest would look like. If they organized a march, a proper march, and got people to march down the streets, if they signed petitions, you know, if they were standing on the, you know, out in the rain with their signs and yelling on megaphones and so on, that would be protest. You know, gluing yourself to a window is not a, you know, so that other people can't get into a business, or disrupting a business, and by gluing yourself to their window, that's not protest. That's vandalism.
Yeah, and I should add now that they've attached these pipes to each other, like full industrial pipes, so that police, they have to spend hours and hours to basically use a chainsaw to cut them out of it. Now, we should talk about some good news this week, which is, well, these are all globalists, these Extinction Rebellion protests. It's a global movement. There were 130 arrests in Westminster in London. This is where, I'm not sure if it's based in London, but this is where it seems to have most of its high-profile things. The police have actually cracked down on one of them. Well, they've even tried to fly drones over Heathrow Airport to disrupt planes, which could actually result in planes crashing or crashing into each other. It's really highly dangerous.
And I believe the ones in London were the ones who got a fire truck full of red dye and sprayed it all over poor sandstone. And
how many emissions to clean that up?
Probably like 10 farting cows for 1 year, maybe.
And I noticed that some Extinction Rebellion protesters were spotted in McDonald's, which is because they all want us to be vegans as well, because of the farting cows. And I noticed that
the chips in McDonald's are probably vegan.
Yeah. I noticed that one left-wing journalist, he responded by like, "Oh, Extinction Rebellion protesters have to eat as well." Well, if they cared for the earth, why didn't they go to Lord of the Fries, which is a vegan fast food outlet? Why did they go to McDonald's?
Hypocrisy at its finest.
Yes. Well, going on to, the good news of the week is that, our Prime Minister, Scott Morison, in a speech to the Lowy Institute last week, he spoke out against globalism, saying, well, we do cooperate internationally. It's up to nations themselves. I'll just bring up the text of the speech. He referred to it as negative globalism. He says it does not serve our national interests when international institutions demand conformity rather than independent cooperation on global issues. And yeah, he says we should avoid negative globalism that coercively seeks to impose a mandate from an often ill-defined, borderless global community, and worse still, an unaccountable internationalist bureaucracy. And he said only a national government, especially one accountable through the ballot box and the rule of law, can define its national interest. We can never answer to a higher authority than the people of Australia. Amen, brother.
Very good. And may be surprising to some, but our Deputy Prime Minister, Winston Peters, actually endorsed that speech the other day. He backed up Scott Morison's words and said that he was absolutely in agreement with them, and that the ill effects of globalism should be it's not all sweet smelling roses.
Could Winnie be motivated by perhaps there's an election in 1 year?
Yes, there is almost exactly a year from now there will be an election, and I am very much inclined to think that he is gearing up for his election campaign, because he suddenly started speaking like his old nationalist self again. He's been having a bad day though. It was just before we went live, I read an article saying that a list of over 1,000 names, addresses, I'll just check exactly the list if I still have it open. Here you go. So a database of over 1,000 names, occupations, phone numbers, addresses, and membership statuses affiliated with New Zealand First were leaked, and they were sent to a host of media outlets. Simon Bridges, the leader of the opposition, Paula Bennett, who's the deputy leader of the National Party, and David Seymour, who is the leader of the ACT Party. So they now may have the names of 1,000 disgruntled New Zealand First members, because the New Zealand First has been having a number of high-profile leaks this past week. Someone has leaked a number of internal documents saying that the majority of members were unhappy that New Zealand First had gone with the Labour Party in a coalition. They had members who were upset about the placement of MPs, even some accusing the party of being sexist, because only three women were in the top 20 spots of the party's list, and others accusing it of being a dictatorship run by Winston Peters. So what's happened today, or just this evening, is another really bad day for Winston Peters.
Well, I'd say it's a cult of personality because, well, if you call it a dictatorship by Winston Peters, when he retires or passes on, that'll pretty much be the end of the party. And when I interviewed Ron Mark, who was the deputy New Zealand First leader back in 2017.
And he is actually our defence minister at the
Yes, I asked him that question, what's going to happen, because basically what's happened to all these minor parties when, except for the Greens, when the founder retires, that's it.
Absolutely, and that is a very real possibility with Winston Peters, and there's a lot of talk about the succession and who's going to be running the show. Shane Jones has been floated as the name who's been brought in to succeed Winston Peters, but he doesn't have the cult of personality. He doesn't have the charisma that Peters has. Shane Jones has been in the news this last week again for threatening Utu, which for the Australian audience means revenge, against his opponents, but the people in the forestry industry who he's been giving money to. He has been given a $1 billion fund to hand out to all of his cousins and friends in the forestry industry and other primary industries, especially up north. And every time he has a meeting with them, he says, "I've given you the money, now show me the votes."
Yes, I think that speaks for itself.
Yes, it does. And surprisingly, he still holds his ministerial portfolios. He has been lightly rebuked by the Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern. Winston Peters has been completely silent on this issue. And I am kind of surprised there hasn't been that big of an outcry about this. But it's basically considered to be okay in New Zealand politics.
Wow. Now, obviously, like those leaks from New Zealand First about dissatisfaction, you can understand those, but leaking all the members' personal information, I assume that's illegal under electoral law.
Yeah, so it's been referred to the police. I have read in that story. It is developing. It came out 15 minutes before we went live today. So we will likely have more on that next week. They may even have the identity of the leaker, but it wasn't leaked to the public. So as long as the media party, the National Party, and the ACT Party keep it to themselves, then it's not in the public domain. Which the members whose data has been leaked will be happy-ish with. At least it's not out there in the open at the moment. But it would likely still be criminal to leak it to anybody at all.
Yes, obviously this person, they've got a real axe to grind. And going back to that cult of personality with minor parties, that's basically the same with our most prominent nationalist party in Australia, One Nation. Well, it's called Pauline Hanson's One Nation Party, and a lot of nationalists, they do have issues with a lot of Pauline Hanson's beliefs and direction in recent years, but no other nationalist party that's been founded over the past 10 years has been able to do any good. It's all of the voters that have just voted for the nationalists they know, which is Pauline Hanson.
Mm-hmm. And it's been a similar thing like that in New Zealand politics, where Winston Peters has always kind of been the nationalist go-to, but he's not really he's not an ideologue. He does what suits him, really, and people get burnt, but they keep coming back and putting him back in Parliament each election because he's been around for a very, very, very long time.
Now, you'd be aware that in Australia we have a pretty large ex-PMs club at the moment.
Oh, yes.
Well, Troy Bramston, who writes for the Murdoch-owned Australian newspaper, is actually a former Labor speechwriter, but he's been interviewing the ex-Liberal Prime Ministers this week, and it's been one a day at the moment. So Monday was Tony Abbott, where he said that if offered, he'd still like to serve in Parliament again, but he thinks it's unlikely the approach will be made. Tony Abbott lost his in a Harbourside, Sydney seat of Wirringa at the federal election to climate change activist independent Zali Steggall, basically because in the demographic voting trends is that traditionally eastern Sydney, where the wealthy people live, was Liberal heartland, blue room Liberal seat, and Western Sydney working class Labor seats. There's actually the swing in the east is going to the left, while the swing to the right is going out west. And so they've been talked about, could Tony Abbott stand for a Western Sydney Labor-held seat, because his conservatism, his climate change skepticism, other brand of conservative policies would actually be more appealing in those seats, rather than basically the Chardonnay socialists in Wirringa, who've they want climate action, but they're not too keen on windmills for Wirringa, which there was a petition floating around for.
And we've actually got a similar shift in New Zealand, just like you do in most countries, where the rich basically have gone super woke, and the middle class is wondering how they're going to pay their bills, because the rich don't bear the brunt of this the so-called climate change action. All of the poor people end up paying those taxes. And the new Conservative Party in New Zealand as well is likely to try and target some more of these these traditional Labour voters, and is working to appeal to these people and say, hey, look, the Labour Party's done nothing for you, and come and join us.
And today we had Malcolm Turnbull interviewed, where he lambasted the climate deniers in the Liberal Party for scuttling his national energy guarantee, which he announced then ditched in the dying days of his prime ministership, and said that it's them, the denialists, they're causing power prices to be high, and it's conservative value to take action on climate change.
I would say no to that.
Basically, because this is, it's 3 or 4 months after the federal election, which Scott Morison won an emphatic mandate. Both of these two ex-Liberal PMs are now out of Parliament, and so that they can say whatever they want. Any journalist can go and interview them, but they're irrelevant now. I mean, it's the MPs who are in the party room now, they're the ones that matter. And so I don't think, with just under 3 years until the next federal election, because Labor's been trying to say, oh, look at this divided Liberal Party. It's they're obviously clutching at straws there. Scott Morison, I have no doubt, would just get on with the job. I mean, they're getting pretty desperate, Scott Morison's enemies in the media, because they've tried to go after his one of his friends, the Hillsong pastor. I'll just make sure I get his name right.
There are a lot of Hillsong pastors, by the way. I was going to float a name, and I was like, no, there's at least 5 of them or something.
Brian Houston, yes. So he's controversial because his father was in the middle of child sexual abuse in the Hillsong church, and so they used that connection to attack Scott Morison, because it was leaked from the White House that Scott Morison wanted to invite him to the state dinner, but the Trump White House vetoed it. And Scott Morison said, I'm not going to comment on gossip. That's one of his things. He does that because he's actually been emulating a lot of Trumpisms, Scott Morison. Like, how Donald Trump, if he gets a question he doesn't like, he says fake news. Well, yes. Scott Morison, his thing is, oh, that's a Canberra bubble question. I'm just going to leave that in the bubble. And also on the weekend, The Guardian reported that Scott Morison's got a personal friend who believes the QAnon theory about the elites and pedophilia. So he's gone from being accused with being too close with pedophiles for being too close with somebody who wants to expose pedophiles. It's the classic throw mud until it sticks. Yeah. Well, the other bit of muck they think they've got on him is there's this rumor floating around online that in 1997 Scott Morrison shat his pants at a McDonald's after the 1997 NRL Grand Final when his Cronulla Sharks lost. So that's got a lot of people on, well, not just social media. There was actually a few articles published about this rumor. So that's sort of another sort of scandal they're trying to dig up on Scott Morrison.
And I've got an airplane coming overhead now. I think since we're heading up to closing time, I want to finish with one last bit of good news from New Zealand, which is that the aid that we have been giving to the Clinton Foundation has officially been stopped. So the New Zealand taxpayer has given millions of dollars to the Clinton Foundation over the past few years. And this was something set up by the previous national government. And we have been told that it has finally been stopped this year. So no more money being sent to Bill and Hillary. That's a big win for New Zealanders.
Yes, because we republished your report on that when Jacinda Ardern first gave that money. And yeah, even though it's New Zealand taxpayers' money, there was so much reaction to our republishing of it in Australia just because everyone knows just how it's basically a money laundering foundation, the Clinton Foundation. And so Australians still considered it a crime against them that this globalist body had got an injection of funds. All right, well, yeah, it's past the top of the hour. Well, 8 p.m. here in Melbourne, and it's 10 p.m. in Auckland.
p.m.
So
I'm gonna let you do your close.
Yep. So it's Tuesday night is of course just one night in the Australian alt media lineup. Tomorrow night I'll be back with another episode of Wilms Front, 7 p.m. Melbourne time on the Tim Wilms YouTube channel. My guest will be Rosalie Cristani, who's a councillor with the city of Casey, who's been associated with the Rise Up Australia Party. The city of Casey, it's basically the centre of demographic change in Melbourne, and will basically determine how the multicultural experiment in Australia pans out. And Rosalie is a councillor at the centre of this, and so I'm really looking forward to sitting down with her. And just obviously she's a pillar of that community. She associates with all the different groups there, and so it'll give us a real first-hand account of just how multiculturalism is faring in one of the most diverse and demographically changing areas of Melbourne. And of course, at 8:15 p.m. Melbourne time, that's with Dear Beltran's weekly live stream. She's got Kiralee Smith as her guest, who formerly was with Halal Choices, which was a halal certification information organization. Kiralee Smith, she's now the director of Binary, which, as the name suggests, is protecting the science that there's two genders. Yes. So she's been very prominent in the media, trying to correct that. Yes, according to science, there's just two genders. And of course, Thursday evening, the preeminent show of the Australian alt media, The Uncockables, 8:30 p.m. Melbourne time on its dedicated YouTube channel. And then I'm back on Friday night at 7 p.m. again for another Wilms Front. And any New Zealand alt media, is there anything?
No. I'm running very quietly into the end of the year. Got a busy personal life at the moment, expecting another baby in a couple of months. So this is basically all that I'm doing at the moment. And I've got a few other little things planned, but likely things are a bit quiet for me for the next few months. But if you are interested, rightminds.nz will have my latest articles, and also the befd.co.nz. I write for them as well. And that really is all that I've got. So thank you for your support, people who support me, and those of you who support Tim, and everyone who supports this show as well.
Yes. if you want to support either the Unshackled or Right Minds, well, for the Unshackled, you can go to the unshackled.net/membership or the unshackled.net/donate or patreon.com/the Unshackled or paypal.me/the Unshackled. And there is the one last chance to send through a super chat if you feel so inclined.
And the place to donate to me is at rightminds.nz/donate, and all of the details are there. And we will be back next Tuesday at the usual time, 7 p.m. in Melbourne and 9 p.m. here in Auckland. And we will likely have a lot more information on the stories that have been developing. It is going to be, I think, a very interesting time, especially leading up into the election next year here in New Zealand. This show likely is going to continue to get very interesting.
Yes, well, we basically are now. We started this show at the right time. It's a globalist Tasman community, because we're finding every week there's a common theme in our politics. It's been quite incredible.
It has been, and yeah, it's just really nice to sit down and talk about, okay, what's happening in New Zealand, what's happening in Australia, and then just to tie it all together, and it makes for quite an entertaining evening for the two of us, and I hope for all of our audience as well.
I've just got a last minute super chat from Cla Key for 10 New Zealand dollars. They haven't written anything for me to say, but thank you for the super chat anyway. It's much appreciated. All right,
Thank you very much.
We'll sign off tonight. Thank you for everyone who watched on the Unshackled channel.
And thank you to our watchers on the Right Minds channel as well. Good night.
See you next week.
Thanks for tuning in to this week's edition of Trans-Tasman Talk. To keep up with the latest real news and analysis from the Tasman nations, visit theunshackled.net and rightminds.nz.